Douglas Mawson and M went ahead. Behind them, Belgrave Ninnis controlled the sled, carrying most of the food supplies, equipment, and the 6 strongest dogs of the expedition. The 3 men had traveled across hundreds of kilometers of frozen land, but in Antarctica, all it takes is a patch of snow thinner than usual, and everything can change in an instant. Suddenly, the ground beneath Nimis collapsed. Hidden under the snow that appeared solid was a gigantic crevasse covered by a fragile layer of ice. The weight of the sled behind him caused that ice to fail. In that moment, Belgrave Ninnis, his sled, the 6 strongest dogs, and most of the expedition's food supplies were swallowed by this invisible abyss beneath the ice. Everything happened so quickly that no one had time to understand what had happened so quickly that no one had time to understand what had happened. Many years later, Mawson still remembered the feeling of helplessness in that moment. Just a few seconds earlier, he and Ninnis had still been talking to each other, but when the ice collapsed, everything disappeared with it. And then, in that land where almost no life existed, Belgrave Ninnis remained behind forever. Beneath the freezing ice, the only thing that still echoed from the depths was the bitterly cold wind of Antarctica. Mawson and M ran to the edge of the broken crevasse. They repeatedly called their friend's name, but in vain. The only thing that answered them was invisible silence. The loss of Ninnis not only left a void in the expedition team, most of the food supplies, equipment, and the strongest dogs of the expedition had disappeared with him into the abyss. When checking the remaining supplies, Mawson quickly realized a truth that made him shudder. The amount of food they still carried would not be enough to bring both of them back to the base. In his diary, he carefully calculated every ration, and eventually they were forced to accept a decision. No. One wanted to think about the remaining sled dogs, the companions that had traveled with them for many months, were killed, one by one, to become food. It was a brutal decision, but at that time, Mawson and M had no other choice. They used every part they could, including the organs. Among them were the livers of the dogs. What they could not know was that those meals were leading both of them toward another danger. One more silent and more dangerous than the cold of Antarctica itself. Day after day, Mawson watched his companion grow visibly weaker. In the remaining pages of his diary, he recorded how M's skin peeled away, the prolonged fevers, and the increasing exhaustion. Then M began to hallucinate. Sometimes he called for his mother in German. Sometimes he spoke with people who existed only in memory. M stayed by his side through those days. But in that white land, far from every trace of civilization, there was no one who could help them. And then on May 8th, 1913, Xavier M. breathed his last. Now Mawson was the only one left. That night, inside the tent, covered with ice, Douglas Mawson opened his small notebook. He wrote down a few lines. Perhaps he had no idea that more than 100 years later, those very lines would be the handwriting that tells us how his last friend passed away. After the death of M, Douglas Mawson continued the journey alone. Ahead of him, there was still nearly 160 kilometers of frozen terrain before he could return to the base. There were no more sled dogs and no companion beside him. And for many weeks, loneliness and fear were drowned out by the sound of the wind and the heavy breathing of himself. In the home of the blizzard, Mawson recounted that his body began to deteriorate. His hair fell out in clumps. The skin on his hands cracked from the cold and vitamin C deficiency. His fingernails gradually came off, but it was his feet that frightened him the most. There were mornings when, after taking off his socks, part of the skin on the soles of his feet came off with them. He had to use scissors to cut away the dead skin, bandage the wounds, and continue on his way. But Mawson's ordeal was not over. While continuing his journey, the ground beneath him suddenly collapsed, just like the way his companion had been left beneath the freezing ice. Mawson fell straight into a deep crevasse. Later, he wrote that he himself did not understand why he was still alive. The sled he had been pulling behind him had become lodged at the mouth of the crevasse, and the rope connecting the two sides held him suspended in the dark void below. Mawson understood that if that rope broke, his disappearance would probably remain forever, without an explanation. With the little strength he had left, he began trying to climb back up. Each time he managed to move a little farther, he had to stop to catch his breath. His movements were so cautious that any sudden motion could cause the rope to snap. Then he continued, like that again and again, and finally, somehow, Douglas Mawson returned to the surface of the ice. At that moment, it was as if he had returned from death. In the following days, Douglas Mawson gradually accepted that he might never return. He began copying his scientific records, carefully organizing the papers and placing them inside his coat pocket. If his body were found one day, at least those who came after would understand what had happened to the expedition. There were nights, lying inside the small tent amid the endless howling wind, when Mawson wondered whether he would see the next morning. But then daylight would come again. He would pack his belongings, tie the rope to the sled once more, and continue dragging it a few more kilometers. Day after day, after many weeks alone in the ice, Douglas Mawson finally made it back to the base, but he had arrived too late. The rescue ship had weighed anchor only a few hours earlier. Mawson could only stand there watching it disappear beyond the horizon. Perhaps that was one of the bitterest moments of his life. After all the losses, after a journey that had seemed impossible to overcome, he still could not leave Antarctica. He would have to wait another year and continue living in the land that had taken the lives of his two companions. Douglas Mawson finally returned, and the diary pages he carried returned with him. Thanks to them, today we know what happened during those months. We know about the death of Ninnis. We know about the final days of Mertz. And we know that there was a time when Mawson prepared himself for never seeing his homeland. One more time, more than a century has passed, but that story is still told. Not because it is the story of a man who defeated nature, but because it is a story about fate playing tricks on a man who never stopped moving forward and never surrendered to fate.